September 1939. 2 days after Britain declared war on Germany, a group of elderly men gathered in London. They were not retired. They were not delusional. They were the men who invented the tank, and the War Office had just asked them to do it again. Their instructions were simple. Build the biggest, heaviest, most heavily armoured tank Britain had ever seen. Build it to cross trenches, smash bunkers, and survive direct hits from field artillery. Build it for a war everyone believed would end exactly like the last one. Bogged down in mud along a fortified western front, they built it, an 80-ton monster, 33 feet long, powered by a 600-horsepower diesel engine, driving electric motors. It looked like it had crawled straight out of 1916, and by the time it was finished, the war it was designed for had already ceased to exist. This is the story of the TOG heavy tanks, the most spectacular dead end in British armoured engineering, and the hidden innovations buried inside machines the world wrote off as jokes. The committee called itself the Old Gang. The War Office gave it the formal title Special Vehicle Development Committee, but the men who sat on it preferred the acronym TOG, and they wore it as a badge of honour. Every single member had personal direct involvement in creating the world's first tanks during World War I. Sir Albert Stern chaired the group. A banker by profession, educated at Eton and Oxford, Stern had served as secretary of the original Landships Committee in 1915, and later ran the entire Mechanical Warfare Supply Department. According to his own memoir, a senior official once asked him what qualified him to oversee tank production. Stern answered that he was a banker. The official replied that this made it still more mysterious. Sir Eustace Tennyson Daincourt had chaired the Landships Committee itself, appointed by Winston Churchill in February 1915. He was the Royal Navy's Director of Naval Construction, the man who designed HMS Hood. Major Walter Gordon Wilson and Sir William Tritton had been officially recognised by the 1919 Royal Commission on awards to inventors as the co-inventors of the tank. Wilson suggested extending the tracks around the entire vehicle to create the rhomboidal shape of the Mark I. Tritton, as managing director of William Foster and Company in Lincoln, built every World War I tank prototype. Sir Harry Ricardo designed the engines. His 150 horsepower 6-cylinder motor powered all British heavy tanks from the Mark V onward. Over 8,000 Ricardo tank engines were manufactured during the Great War. Major General Sir Ernest Swinton originated the concept of a tracked armoured fighting vehicle in October 1914 and coined the word tank as a code name in December 1915. These were the most qualified tank designers alive. The War Office assembled them because Britain feared a repeat of the Western Front stalemate. That fear was not irrational. France had built the Maginot Line. Germany had constructed the Siegfried Line, a 400-mile defensive system of bunkers, anti-tank ditches and concrete obstacles. The General Staff expected the two armies to entrench between these fortifications exactly as they had in 1914. The specification, coded RBM-17, which some believe stood for Really Big Machine, demanded extraordinary capabilities. The tank had to cross a 16-foot wide anti-tank ditch unaided. It had to climb a 7-foot wall. It had to survive hits from 47mm and 37mm anti-tank guns, and from 105mm howitzers at 100 yards. Maximum speed was set at just 5 miles per hour. Estimated weight was 70 to 75 tons. This was a siege engine, not a cavalry weapon. And the committee's initial response was a modern turreted design. The military rejected it. The War Office demanded a more conservative World War I-style vehicle, with wraparound tracks and side sponsons. The common narrative that out-of-touch old men imposed Great War thinking on a modern conflict has it backwards. The retrograde specifications came from the generals, not from the designers. TOG 1 was built at William Foster and Company in Lincoln, the same factory that produced Little Willie and the Mark I. Construction began in February 1940. The first trial took place on September 27, 1940. The machine was unmistakably a child of the Great War. Its tracks ran up over the top of the hull and back down in the classic rhomboidal layout identical to British tanks from 1916 through 1918. The hull had no suspension at all, riding directly on the tracks. It stretched 33 feet 3 inches long, 10 feet 3 inches wide, and 10 feet tall. Designed weight with full armour was between 80 and 90 tons, though the prototype tested lighter at around 65 tons because its cemented armour plates were never fully fitted. The engine was genuinely innovative. Harry Ricardo designed the Paxman Ricardo 12 TP, a 59-litre V12 diesel producing 600 horsepower. The transmission was diesel-electric. 2 generators fed 2 English electric traction motors, 1 per track. Steering worked through a potentiometer connected to the steering wheel that varied voltage to each side. Ferdinand Porsche independently pursued an almost identical diesel-electric concept for his Tiger prototype. The first official demonstration followed on October 6, 1940, though notably without the 2-pounder gun installed in the turret. The results were discouraging. The electric motors overheated and burned out. They could not handle the generator's full output. Top speed reached only 7 miles per hour against the hoped-for 8.5. The tank was 3 times longer than it was wide, making directional changes a constant struggle. Trials continued through June 1941 before testing was halted for a transmission redesign. An SSS synchro self-shifting gearbox was installed by August 1941. By May 1943, a complete conversion to hydraulic drive was fitted. The tank redesignated TOG-1A. The hydraulic system also proved unsatisfactory, suffering from excessive time lag between the driver's inputs and the track response. The prototype was sent to Chobham in early 1944 and vanished from records, presumably scrapped. Only one TOG-1 was ever built. TOG-2, authorised in May 1940, and first running on March 16, 1941, represented the committee's preferred modern design. The most significant change was the tunnel track arrangement. Instead of climbing over the hull, the return track dropped below floor level in a recessed channel. This freed space for a 70-inch turret ring 10 inches wider than a Cromwell's. That turret ring would prove critical. The twin-generator electric drive solved the overheating problem by using 2 separate generators side by side, rather than cramming both into a single casing. After torsion bar suspension replaced the original unsprung rigid rollers in April 1943, the modified TOG-2 Star, according to Paxman Company records, performed faultlessly in trials and became a reliable vehicle. Now, before we look at how this monster compared to the tanks that actually fought the war, if you are enjoying this deep dive into British engineering, hit subscribe. It takes a second, costs nothing, and helps the channel grow. Right, let's get into the numbers. TOG-2 Star weighed 80 tons. 80. According to contemporary reports, the prototype was so heavy they could only weigh half of it at a time. Hull length was 33 feet 3 inches. Overall length with the gun was 37 feet 9 inches. Front armour was 76 millimeters. Side armour was 76 millimeters. The engine remained the same 600 horsepower Paxman Ricardo diesel. Here is something almost every source on the internet gets wrong. The TOG-2 Star does not carry a 17-pounder gun. The Tank Museum at Bovington confirmed this in a December 2024 video. The weapon is a 28-pounder composite gun, a 28-pounder barrel based on the QF 3.7-inch anti-aircraft gun mated to a 17-pounder breech and muzzle brake. It fires a 94mm round, not the 76.2mm shell of the standard 17-pounder. This weapon sat on the developmental path toward the 32-pounder, eventually fitted to the A-39 Tortoise heavy assault tank. The turret itself used a Metadyne electromechanical traverse system, providing smooth, precise power rotation. This turret design, built by Stothert and Pitt, was later adapted for the A-30 Challenger cruiser tank. In December 1941, when the tank board discussed mounting the 17-pounder in a tank, the TOG-2 was the only British design with a turret ring large enough to accept it. The comparative numbers explain why the project died. The Churchill Mark 7 weighed 40.6 tons, roughly half the TOG, yet carried 152mm of frontal armour, double the TOG's 76. The Tiger 1 weighed 57 tons with 100mm of frontal protection and a road speed of 45 km per hour, more than 3 times the TOG's 14. The Soviet ES-2 weighed 46 tons with 120mm of sloped frontal armour and a 122mm gun. Even the American M26 Pershing achieved 102mm of frontal armour at just 42 tons. The TOG's critical flaw was that every plate of armour was flat and vertical, providing zero ballistic advantage from angling. A sloped plate of equal thickness deflects far more energy, because the shell must travel through more metal. Every competitor exploited this principle. The TOG did not. Where it held a genuine edge was firepower. The 17-pounder class weapons were among the finest anti-tank guns of the war. The standard 17-pounder achieved roughly 130mm of penetration at 500 meters with APCBC ammunition and over 200mm with their PD's rounds available from mid-1944. The 28-pounder on the TOG-2 Star was at least as capable, but mounting a superior gun on an immobile platform is a questionable design philosophy when the enemy can simply drive around you. The American parallel is instructive. The M6 heavy tank weighed 57 tons with 83 to 100mm of armour and a 76mm main gun. It suffered an almost identical fate. General Devers declared in December 1942 that due to its tremendous weight and limited tactical use, There was no requirement in the armoured force for a heavy tank. 40 M6s were built. None saw combat. The TOG and the M6 were twin victims of the same realisation. The heavy breakthrough tank was a concept without a mission. The Soviets persisted with heavy tanks, fielding the KF-1 and later the IS-2, but even they kept weights under 50 tons through disciplined use of sloped armour. The project had been effectively dead since late 1941. The Blitzkrieg conquest of France in May and June 1940 shattered every assumption about static warfare. The trench stalemate never materialised. Mobile combined arms warfare was the new reality, and an 80-ton tank that crawled at walking pace had no role in it. Making matters worse, Churchill's accession as Prime Minister reactivated a 23-year personal grudge against Stern dating from their 1917 dispute over tank production. The committee was systematically sidelined. The supreme irony is that the tank which ultimately filled the infantry support role the TOG was designed for was named the Churchill. On May 27, 1943, according to Paxman Company records, the old gang assembled to watch a late trial. The TOG 2-star performed flawlessly. 6 elderly pioneers stood watching their creation do everything it was designed to do, in a war that no longer needed it. The project was formally abandoned in 1944, yet elements of the TOG program survived. The Paxman Ricardo 12TP engine became hugely successful, powering British tank landing craft. Over 3,500 were produced during the war. The Stothert and Pitt turret design influenced the A-30 Challenger. The 28-pounder gun evolved into the 32-pounder fitted to the Tortoise. Harry Ricardo went on to work with Frank Whittle on jet engines. The committee's struggle with Britain's restrictive railway loading gauge, which limited turret ring diameter and thus gun size throughout the war, contributed to the decision to disregard it entirely for the Centurion, Britain's revolutionary post-war main battle tank. The TOG 2's 70-inch turret ring had demonstrated that bigger rings meant bigger guns, and that insight shaped every British tank that followed. The committee also designed an amphibious underwater tank concept. Stern, an amateur sailor, proposed launching tanks from converted whaling vessels. The idea went nowhere, but it proved that even in failure, these men never lacked imagination. The sole surviving TOG 2-star has sat at the Tank Museum Bovington since the 1950s. At 80 tons, it remains the heaviest tank in the entire collection. For decades, most visitors walked past without a second glance. Then the video game World of Tanks turned it into one of the most beloved memes in gaming history. Players nicknamed platoons of 3 TOGs the Royal Navy. The Tank Museum now sells extensive TOG merchandise, and credits the game with launching the tank into viral popularity. Legend has it that the old gang chose their acronym knowing full well what it implied, aging veterans having one last crack at the problem they solved a quarter-century earlier. Whether true or not, the name stuck, and the machine they created proved something important about military engineering. The TOG tanks were a rational answer to a specific military problem. The specification came from the War Office. The designers were the most qualified tank engineers alive. The technology was genuinely innovative. Diesel-electric drive, tunnel tracks enabling larger turret rings, experimental composite guns. The 28-pounder could destroy any tank in the war. What killed the TOG was history itself. 6 weeks of Blitzkrieg rendered its fundamental concept obsolete. No amount of engineering brilliance could save an 80-ton siege engine in a war of 45-km/h panzer thrusts. You can build the perfect weapon for the last war, but the next war will not cooperate. British engineering was not at fault. The question was, and the men of the old gang, the inventors of the tank itself, built the finest possible answer to a question the battlefield had already stopped asking.